What's up, guys? It's Johnny Candito of Candito Training HQ. We're rolling here with some more frequent videos. The mortgage ain't gonna pay itself. That being said, today is a great question. How to fix your deadlift lockout. Now I'm gonna look specifically at the conventional deadlift because sumo's gay. So the very first answer here is going to be, I recommend your secondary squat day to be at under RP7 across the board. So not one set that's harder than RP7 or at RP7 even. Now, this being said, I also recommend that if you do 3 squat days, you have your third day be at RP6 or easier and your second day be at RP6 or easier, and then only 1 hard day. Now that's a pretty rare thing when it comes to powerlifting programming, especially on more cookie cutter templates. Typically speaking, you're going to see some RP7 or 8, like high bar squat or high bar constant tension squat, and push that secondary day. Now that's fine, but this question is on fixing your deadlift lockout. And also, I should have added, it's on what to do if you have a 1-year plateau on your deadlift as well. So if we're shifting the focus, the first most subtle way to do it is to just decrease that RPE on some of those second and third days while still keeping the primary squat day all the way and exactly the same in every other feature so that you're not sacrificing that whatsoever, but just adjusting things just enough to massage it so that you're getting that recovery. Because when it comes to deadlift plateau, by far the biggest factor is going to be recovery. Now the second point is the person asking this question is specifically on my 8-week peak. If you want to join the Candito Forever program, I strongly recommend it. There's nothing that you could do that follows my advice more than running those programs, than joining the Candito Forever program so I can help you all the way. Everything else, I can only help just un poquito. Now that being said, he's running the 8-week peak, which is a Google Sheet that you can download, and there's multiple versions of it. And he is running the 2 times a week squat program version. And in this, there's a 5x4 secondary day, which is actually very easy, intentionally so, with ascending sets. So this program already does kind of fit the mold. But what I recommend is the primary squat day has a 5x3 squat and then your primary deadlifts. So what I recommend doing is a 4x3 on the primary squat day instead of a 5x3. And then, especially if you're at all on the edge as far as really focusing on this, I would actually shift the 5x4 secondary day to a 4x4. And that's actually very easy to do because percentage-wise, there's at the end of the ascending, there's 2 sets of 4 at a certain percentage, at like 77.5%. So just do 1 set of 4 there. So by shifting from a 5x3 and a 5x4 to a 4x4 and a 4x3 on squats, that alone is really going to open up a lot for your deadlift. Again, a lot of times it's not the sexy decisions. It's a matter of what you're not doing as much as it is what you are doing. And this is why we see all the time that when someone has a deadlift plateau, a lot of times it's best to actually have a 1-to-1 ratio. So that's what is in this program. You have 1 secondary deadlift day where you're doing stiff leg deadlifts or any other option that you have, and then you have 1 regular competition deadlift day. What I often see is that really helps people break plateaus, whereas typically if you're doing competition deadlifts twice a week and then you hit a plateau, I would say very rarely does deadlifting 3 times a week competition style end up being worth it. And then a lot of times even just backing off for brief periods to try to find your groove and to see what can get that spark going on that primary day. A lot of times it's more a matter of giving yourself more breathing room and finding the right accessories that takes off a deadlift, unlike the squat. And I think we've all had those moments where you hit a deadlift PR after actually taking a break from training, where all of a sudden then you pull 700 or then you pull 600. So the third tip is going to be pretty interesting here. So I am a little bit torn on what I recommend as far as if you should stick with stiff leg deadlifts or if you really wanted to do low block pulls. I'm actually not as against it as some other people. I personally, for my sumo deadlift, I fixed my lockout issues without altering my starting position by doing low block pulls, and it actually worked, and it was weaker. And you can always tell if it's a problem if you're literally weaker at the movement than you are on off the floor deadlifts. And actually, Louis Simmons was a big fan of this, a very, very slight block to where you're really only getting a few inches out of it. And then it actually can make you weaker, like I said, because now you're shifting onto your hamstrings earlier and your shin angle will actually be more vertical.
Right before he pulled the 900 into me, we put the plates on 4-inch mats. We raised it off the ground 4 inches. He barely could pull 810. What that showed us was he used an enormous amount of leg drive to do his deadlifts. So when we raised the bar and took the leg drive out, his deadlift fell down, 10%. And that's a lot.
However, the key point I want to say is you have to make 2 adjustments to this. So first of all is you do have to make sure your starting position is not scooping it. So you don't want to try to maximize for this lift. So you don't want to really start to cheat it and start to emulate your leg drive just with a shorter range of motion and then kind of pop it and then almost like a clean jerk, really get those quads involved. We don't want to do that. So actually embrace that harder position and don't scoop. And then secondly, the key point is I actually recommend increasing reps by 2. So +2. So for example, on this program, it's 7 reps and 5 reps and different 4-week waves on the 8-week of the stiff leg deadlifts. So if you're going to do a low block pull, and I mean very low, as far as how much weight you're at or how much distance you're adding. So maybe just 1 bumper plate each side to then put the bar on. I would say probably beyond that, you could do 2 bumper plates. But I would say no matter what, it has to be the bars below your knees. But I would actually recommend it well below your knees. So if you do that and then, like I said, add 2 reps, then you're going to be doing 9s and 7s going into that peak. And that'll actually be a pretty effective way of doing it because it ensures that you're not tempted to use too heavy of load. And also because you're reducing the range of motion itself, it's more beneficial to do higher reps, similar to sumo deadlift being more beneficial or being more responsive to higher reps than a conventional, because we're also looking at literal amount of mechanical work as well. Now, the 4th point, and I saved this for number 4 because it's a little bit more obvious, but it still bears repeating. Fix your starting position. So I actually put a poll up on Instagram on if anyone has seen someone correct their deadlift without altering their starting position and correct their lockout. Have you just ever seen that through strengthening and not a technical change? Okay, I have a question for you guys. Have you ever seen, and I'm not talking about if it's possible, I'm saying have you ever seen a lifter fix their conventional deadlift lockout without changing their starting position? Now, I'm not going to say it's impossible because actually a super strong lifter said yes. And I also think that it is possible because, again, with my sumo, I've done it and it just makes sense that's possible. But the main point is it's relatively improbable. So that being said, fix that starting position no matter what. And a lot of times what happens is people have too positive of a shin angle and they're also rushing the start. So they're really herky-jerky. And then with their knees too far bent to where then the bar rolls back, they lose position, they lose their back. It's not predictable across loads. And then it's really just the fact that you're pulling from a horrible position that ultimately is the problem. You know, obviously, if that's you, what really can be beneficial is to cycle through pause deadlifts actually as a primary movement on some cycles. That can be wise. But on other programs, you can have it as a secondary movement. I will say, for example, on my 8-week peak, I actually don't recommend ever doing the pause deadlift secondary because the program's not made for that in mind. So it actually is intentionally made to where you're only getting into that competition stance 1 time a week. And I definitely think you actually can make it work. And there actually are some interesting upsides when focusing more on muscularity as the solution rather than technical. But ideally, you're just doing both. You're focusing on better technique on the primary day, while at the same time, you're actually focusing on strengthening that weak position on the secondary day to attack it from different angles. That being said, point number 5, and this is already in the program, is the hammer barbell back extensions. Now, there's just 1 hard set on the primary day, but again, it's a primary squat and deadlift day, so you already got a ton to work with here. But really make that set count. Barbell back extensions can do so much to fixing your lockout. Just like that super strong lifter who mentioned GHRs, I would consider barbell back extensions as good or even better for a lot of people. And that's why Pete Rubish, Chance Mitchell, who actually had a lockout issue, credited with the barbell back extension for strengthening his lockout big time. And especially if you're someone where you find that, okay, I'm strongest with a little bit of lumbar flexion extension, you just want to get brutally strong. Now, one thing I do advise is if you can, to try to find a range of motion where you can actually have some flexion in the bottom position, if not a neutral position, rather than staying super extended all the time. So if you do need to hold plates instead of a barbell to do this, then that's fine. Then I would actually rather see someone do that and get that fuller range of motion because, again, sometimes it can be easy to train a position you're not actually going to be in. So if you're training a super extended position, but then in the end of the day with your pull, you know you get pitched forward. Well, you want to train kind of getting pitched forward and then pulling all the way through on your third tier movements, on those like kind of bodybuilding movements that have some functionality, but ultimately aren't to emulate your technical position like a stiff leg deadlift would or snatch grip deadlift, where there's a little bit more of a carryover, which we will talk about that at the end of this video. Speaking of that, when it comes to number 6, it's the snatch grip deadlift I actually recommend you avoid. And that may be a little bit counterintuitive to some people, but it again gets back to the issue of a positive shin angle. I actually find a lot of times snatch grip deadlift is a great movement to extend the range of motion after you already have a phenomenal position, technically speaking. It can be a little bit difficult for some people, especially on a conventional deadlift. I think a wide stance snatch grip deadlift for sumo pullers, I think is very organic, very easy, and there's not really that much confusion because the sumo still is significantly different, and you can have a positive shin angle on that and still have a pretty vertical shin angle on sumo, and people can keep them separated because your hands, fundamentally are going from outside to inside. Whereas with a conventional deadlift, a lot of times if you do those snatch grip deadlifts, what you can end up kind of training is you kind of kick the bar out more, you're kind of dipping the hips a little too low, just having these patterns to where it becomes this 2-part lift rather than it being one natural hip hinge movement. So it's not impossible. I want to be clear on that. And I think that snatch grip deadlifts, even for conventional deadlifts, deadlifters are phenomenal. But if you have a deadlift lockout issue, there's such a good chance that there's an issue with your starting position, and you want to focus on your hamstring and posterior chain strength with a slightly more vertical shin angle, because that ultimately is when you're missing. You are absolutely out of that leg drive position. So it really doesn't make too much sense to focus on deficit pulls nor to focus on snatch grip deadlifts. And instead it makes sense to focus on those aspects that are focusing on where you're missing and why. And this gets to my final recommendation. If you are going to do stiff leg deadlifts, and this one was a little bit tricky, I actually had to think about this a lot, but I have a prime example that I want to kind of use as a story to tell, is Nathaniel Messiah. He is going to be our example here because he had a horrible deadlift lockout. Honestly, he had awful deadlift technique here. It sucks. But he was always a super strong lifter, a phenomenal lifter, and he developed over time massively on his deadlift and became a proficient athlete and one of the best powerlifters, in Great Britain history, and one of the best deadlifters, naturally, of all time. Now, the reason why it's such an interesting story is because on his secondary day, he does stiff leg deadlifts very strictly.
Stiff leg deadlifts are the best exercise to increase your deadlift. Like, for me at least, hands down. They fix my weak point, which is my hamstrings. They really teach you how to hinge. They allow you to train intense without using too much weight. They literally drop like 60 kilos off of your deadlift. The heaviest I've ever worked up to is 220 for a set of 5, and I deadlift 342.5 kilos. Like, stiff legs are crazy. And as you can see, I get a little bit of lumbar lordosis in there, like really just to kind of exaggerate it. Because when you do stiff legs, sometimes you really don't even know if you're stiff-legged, especially as it starts getting hard.
And I think this is an interesting approach because by doing it extremely strictly on a secondary day, and he does ascending sets in his case, what that does is it gives you a lot of reps with a perfect position that you're not going to emulate perfectly with your actual competition deadlift, but it does bias you towards the average of those two. And that, again, is why I like that 1-to-1 ratio so much, because it's a matter of not just the position you're going to be in, but also the position you're not going to be in. So this isn't something to add on to primary day. This is something to substitute a certain day to where you're only getting into that really picture perfect position. Now, the interesting part about this, and this is the one downside and why this is such a nuanced topic actually, is if you were to do the opposite in practice, being a little bit more rounded and just try to get really strong in that position, one could make the argument that that could work. However, it just wouldn't be conducive to fixing your starting position at all. So it'd be embracing a rounded back and it'd be building strength in that movement. But then the problem is we get back to that earlier point where I mentioned the poll on how often has that actually worked for people to fix their deadlift without altering their starting position, is very rarely. And then Nathaniel himself has a very interesting story because while he has deadlifted a massive improvement across time, I mean, unbelievable progress, super consistently, he actually still misses at lockout. He misses mid-lift. So, with that being said, it also gets to a Matt Venna video that was phenomenal, where he said, well, do you actually want to shift where you miss? You're going to have to miss at some point. So is it actually a problem?
So maybe if you had your shoulders over the bar, your back perfectly straight, you could lock out perfectly fine. but now you're deadlifting 20 pounds less. Is it worth it? Something has to be the weakest link.
Okay, now here's where things get really interesting. I actually think Nathaniel is making a mistake, potentially. So in the long run, after he fixed the starting position with that strict form stiff leg deadlift, let's pull back up his sticking point here. It is undeniable that he's probably at least a little bit pitched forward. Basically, nobody misses at this point with a perfectly neutral back. So probably lost his upper back at least a little bit, at the least. If he did do stiff leg deadlifts in this position, I think he could train to overcome this exact sticking point, this exact position. And then he would lift more weight because this is also more advantageous off the floor. So you have to solve each issue one at a time. Even if you're dealing with the same sticking point ultimately, you have to look at what's going to cause it. Because if Nathaniel fixes it with a round back stiff leg deadlift, he actually still will probably miss mid lift, like Matt Venna said, because he'll probably just be even more rounded forward. So you have to look at, do you want to have perfect technique but a very small window of tolerance, or do you want to have broader tolerance but also risk reinforcing more extreme habits in kind of pushing the edge of that tolerance? I think Nathaniel's reaching that point of veteran status where he can justify doing the latter, and I think that will be what pushes him to the 850 plus deadlift. However, he has added over 150 pounds to his deadlift relatively recently. So you have to take these pieces of advice with caution and say, okay, let's wait until he reaches that next plateau. And then I think this should be the next decision that he actually makes. And that's my advice to Nathaniel. Now going back to who asked this question, you guys actually haven't seen the video itself. And you can see his starting position is not that good. So he is still in the camp of let's fix that starting position first, because if you do go to the rounded back stiff leg deadlifts, you are going to facilitate or reinforce bad form. Look at from the front. He just needs to narrow his stance. So that's why first you got to absolutely master the basics, then see what remains, and then play to what your lifts are showing you. And then you'll have the answer by reacting rather than forcing a top-down idea just from a video that gave generic advice. Lastly, one piece of advice that you could do is actually add in good mornings on, for example, specifically my 8-week program. There's a slot for single leg hamstring curls. You could do good mornings and actually have stiff leg deadlifts, 3 sets, 2 sets of good mornings on your secondary day. Then on your primary day, you have your competition deadlifts, and then you also have that one hard set of back extensions. So with this combination, you're going to get a lot of work in if you wanted to push that as hard as possible. Not everyone can handle that, but with the lower squat volume, you just might. So if you've been at a year-long plateau, hey, give it a shot because nothing else is working. If nothing's going up, there's no cost of trying something. Reduce that squat volume a bit, blast the posterior chain, and good luck. That being said, Think Deep Squat Deeper shirts available right now. Candido Forever program available right now. And hopefully this video didn't just answer this question more fully than other videos online, but also taught you how to think through it. That's all I'm here for, baby. Peace.